Record on computer. All right, hello everyone. Thank you all who are watching this on YouTube. Today we're going to be doing a lecture on Marxism and its relationship to religion. The lecture is going to be given by Dr. Riggins, who has taught philosophy for many years at New York, NYU, and the New School for Social Research, among others. And those first two, as you know, are probably two of the most prestigious philosophy departments in the country. So it's a real pleasure to have him on to speak on this this polemic topic that so many people get wrong. So there's an article that was published yesterday on the topic. So if you want to check that out along with the video after you watch it on YouTube, that's fine. So let's get started.
I just want to point out I was not in their philosophy departments. I was in their extension education departments in the School of Continuing Education.
Okay.
The humanities division. So I mean, it's nice to say that NYU is one of the most prestigious, but I don't want to be sneaking in there. I had a proletarian philosophical position. Made me grumpy and read Marx, and that's what got me all to show these bourgeois philosophers. Okay, so I got the article here. I'm just going to highlight some things out of it. Historically, Marxism was perceived to be hostile to religion. So this is something dating back to the 19th century when religion was much more influential in our civilization than it is today. Christianity is effectively dead as a motivating religion in the ruling class or in any of the power structures of this society now. There are evangelicals running around, crazy politicians running around, but the whole scientific community and the intellectuals are all practically functioning atheists now. A person like Darwin would never have to put up with what Darwin put up with when he talks about biology or neuroscience. It's the 19th century had those wars and it's over. But religion also in the 19th century, because it was associated with the ruling class, was used to fight against the working class, and it was the old pie in the sky type of religion. In the late 20th century, in Lenin's day, I should get jumped ahead here. Lenin we'll do more with Marx. Marx talked about the opium of the masses. The whole point of that argument, the opium of the masses, is that because the situations you live in are so crummy, you're not going to find any satisfaction here down below. So you might as well know your station, do your duties, and if you behave yourself and the church agrees that you've been a good citizen, you have a chance for pie in the sky later on. And that was the basic function of religion, was social control of masses of people, keeping their consciousnesses dumbed down so they don't understand what Marx wrote about in Capital. And they couldn't understand it because the system hadn't developed so clearly that these class differentiations became obvious to thinkers like Marx. Even Adam Smith knew that they were there, but he didn't have a revolutionary solution. But if you read Adam Smith, he's actually would be more of a liberal Democrat today than he would be a conservative Republican. He was worried about the misuse of the laissez-faire system to exploit people and not to provide living standards, decent living standards for the workers. So he's not the evil Adam Smith that we sometimes on the left think, because we get that misinterpretation of him from the right. So that's the opium of the people. It makes them happy. It gives them something to believe in. And I think that has a function today too. And there are reactionary religious people, the evangelicals, there are some progressive evangelicals, there are a few, but there's a huge mass of Trumpite evangelicals out there who think of him basically as sent by God to deliver America from the evils of the Hollywood Jewish left, or some horrible evil. Lenin also takes the position that religion is something that the communists do not support. They don't see it as positive. They don't see religion as having any positive role. It's simply a tool, one of the many tools of the ruling class to keep working people oppressed. But even in the old days, when religion was primarily 90% could be characterized that way, there were groups that had revolutionary aspirations and had progressive ideas, even if they did not know the type of political action or economic action that was necessary to implement them. They at least had them as ideals. I'm not going to go as far back as the Anabaptists and the religious wars that Lenin wrote about, but the Quakers in England were they had anti-slave movements. They started abolitionist movements. John Wilkes Booth, who shot Lincoln, is named after John Wilkes, who was a radical British anti-slave person. So there was a little tradition, but it wasn't big enough for leftists to put any credence that religion was going to be a help in the struggle. Well, Lenin also believes that, but he's not hostile to religion. It's not that communists are hostile. They, unfortunately, in the history of the communist movement, when some communist parties have been in power, they have violated basic Leninist standards, following other people's viewpoints that may not have been as enlightened as Lenin's. And there was persecution of religious people, but Lenin says the actual relationship between Communist Party and a communist government and religion should be that we ignore it. We allow freedom of religion. If you persecute people, they tend to knuckle down, and it strengthens their movement and their resistance. So he thought if you actually go out and try to fight with them, in the first place, you're wasting your time, because that's not the struggle. The struggle is at the means of production to get working class consciousness and get rid of capitalism. It's not to fight religion. But if you do persecute religion, you get them to be more religious. So you're not, it's not a win-win situation. It's a lose-lose situation for Marxists to engage in that. And that's a tradition that comes in our country from Jefferson and the Enlightenment intellectuals, although they did had a little problem with the slavery issue. But in other respects, they had Enlightenment views. And one of those is that religion should be not state supported, that there should be this wall of separation. Everybody should be able to practice their religion, but it shouldn't have the government on one side or the other. And certainly there shouldn't be special laws. Even giving them tax exemptions, I think, is a violation of Jefferson's principles. Because they violate they're not supposed to be political with the tax exemptions, and they go out and preach right-wing politics from the pulpit. So there's a violation of the Constitution. Okay, so what relationship do we see today that might make religion more progressive? Is we know here in the United States that in the Black liberation movement, religion was one of the major motors of this movement. Black preachers like Martin Luther King were the leaders of the civil rights movement. Even Malcolm X came out of a religious tradition, although it was the Black Muslim tradition, which is not particularly a progressive religion other than its demand for equality of Black people and raising Black consciousness and fighting racism, which is good enough for us to, in general, be sympathetic to some of their demands if we're not enthusiastic about some of their leadership qualifications. So religion today, I think we wouldn't be so hostile against religion today, because there are lots of progressive religious people the Protestant, the Unitarians, and even the Episcopalians. They're about to split into two different types of churches because they're getting so liberal on one side, and there's a right-wing reaction going on amongst the Episcopalians. And the Christian church in Africa has a horrible record when it comes to gay rights. So it comes and goes. That's why we should probably follow Lenin's advice and not get into these religious struggles. But we should remember that if we're communists, we do have a philosophical position that Marxism is based on, and that is dialectical materialism. And if this philosophical basis is not correct, and the basis that makes religion acceptable is correct, there's no reason to think that the end goals of communism are going to be achievable. That is to say, if there is a supernatural realm that is exempt from the laws of physics and other scientific laws in which there can be interventions by beings that can go in contradiction to the laws of science, then you don't know what's going to happen down the road. Maybe then you have people believing the World Trade Center came down because New York was getting a little too risque with the gay population, rather than just as that's what happens when big airplanes full of gasoline melt girders or something. That's all predictable. So we should have a position towards religion, I think, based on Lenin. Say you had a communist party, you have members, people can be members of the Communist Party. You don't have to be of any particular philosophical persuasion. You prefer people to have a realistic understanding of the world they live in, and that understand that Marxism is a form of materialism, and materialism does not accept supernatural explanations. And therefore, you don't have to go around preaching anti-religion. The conclusion would be, of course, that God doesn't have any role to play in Marxism-Leninism. But that doesn't mean you cannot be politically progressive. It's certainly he wouldn't. I think Lenin did say that people can be members of the party if they're religious, and that they should be respected. We should respect the religious beliefs of others and in no way try to insult them or humiliate them or act like we're superior to them, because people do not learn because you preach at them. They learn through their experiences of life. And this world it really sucks in many places. And religion is a way of coping with that. And until we can change those social conditions, until those people and their children are brought up in a world that doesn't need illusions to get through, there will be religious belief. And if we get a socialist world and everything is hunky-dory, religion should gradually die out, at least as a major force or as a political force that could engage in reactionary things. So we should have like a truce with them when it comes to acting politically against capitalism. I don't know if he would think it was appropriate for leaders of communist parties to also be going to church and singing hymns to Jesus. He would think that was sort of anomalous. But there are some places in the world where Marxist people who call themselves Marxists, at any rate, are also believers in Jesus as their savior. Well, there's something wrong with that scene, but I don't know how you're going to change it. So this is basically the views that I think Marxism has on religion. The social conditions that we live in are terrible for millions and millions of people. Because of that, religion has always been throughout history a crutch that has been used by people to get through the rough times. Even you see it today when you see people on television. The tornado goes through the town and tears the local Methodist church to shreds. It's all over the place. And the people are there praying, God, we will rebuild your house. But if you really believe in God and he's doing these things, he's giving you a message there. Maybe he didn't like that house. Maybe you should go down to Baptists who didn't get blown down. But you can't use reason. That's the whole problem with religion. People do not use the rational facilities to make decisions. It's all emotional and feeling and comfort. So there's no sense in trying to argue with people about whether God exists or whether Jesus is their savior, because it's not a matter of logic or scientific proof or any of the things that Marxists like to argue about that has anything to do with why people are religious. So we should leave them alone and let the society take care of them. If we can improve society, if we can get rid of the suffering, if we can give everybody, or if I say we, if the working class can struggle, get consciousness, and bring about the change that in our philosophy it's historically destined to do, it doesn't seem to be quite aware of that. It doesn't seem to pay attention to us when we point out to it what their historical destiny is. But we believe that the contradictions within the capitalist system that will bring about greater economic chaos in the future than capitalism will be able to deal with. We've seen hints of that in capitalist failures and cyclical capitalist unemployment. But eventually that system, according to Marx and according to the logic of how the system has to continually expand, will hit a limit and it will collapse. We have to have philosophical people. We have to have parties in place that understand Marxism and understand how workers can take over these factories and these means of production and work them productively. This happened once in our history in the Soviet Union, but because of the backward nature of that country and the outside pressure from a much more developed capitalist world, that attempt failed. It almost lasted 70 years, but it went the way of the Paris Commune, which only lasted a couple of months. So the Chinese now seem to have picked up that torch and are working in a system that has some capitalist features, but they are under the control of the Communist Party, who uses capitalism to try to alleviate poverty and improve living standards for the great masses of Chinese people, who started at practically zero level at the end of World War II in poverty. And they've made great advances. And if they can continue on the road they are, there's great hope that the socialist revolution that was victorious in St. Petersburg in 1917 will still have a major influence in the rest of this century.
Excellent. Thank you very much. I jotted down a few questions here, so if we want to get that process started now. Well, the most recent thing you mentioned was China and its development and an extension of the torch that the Soviet Union lit. I wanted to ask you about that because there's a big movement towards creating socialism with X characteristics, and I think Xi Jinping is the one that starts this in the governance of China, where he says what we're building is socialism with Chinese characteristics, and people around the world have picked this up. We call part of what our project is doing is trying to build socialism with American characteristics. So part of what that means is China is rescuing some of those Confucian beliefs. Oh, we have someone that said it was Deng. Okay, thank you. Part of what that means is rescuing the Confucian beliefs that are not necessarily as religious as Christianity per se. They're more so philosophical, but they do have a religious dimension to it. What are your thoughts on this process of building socialism with X characteristics that usually has a cultural and religious element to it, intrinsic in the process of building socialism?
Well, I don't think it's necessarily religious.
Mm.
You just say Chinese characteristics. That can, there are lots of characteristics Chinese people have. Too much sodium in their food. That may mean they should have a stronger public health system, for their people. That would be a characteristic. But when the Russians were building in the 20s, when the Russians were trying to figure out how to industrialize and collectivize that, I have socialism with cat characteristics over there. If you can hear the cat in the background. The Bolsheviks talked about the building socialism under the conditions of Russian background and the Russians. So it was going to be, they didn't use that term, but that's what they were talking about, building socialism with Russian characteristics. It's a very destructive cat. The Chinese characteristics, that goes all the way back to Mao on the Long March when he was giving talks in Yunnan. He was talking about specific characteristics of China and the way the socialism is going to have there because of their huge peasant population, which Russians had a peasant population, but they had a more industrial basis than China had. So every country, the Cubans they have built socialism down in Cuba with characteristics that are specifically Cuban and Latin American. You don't see Chinese doing the salsa at their revolutionary balls and stuff. So they all have their characteristics. I don't know if that's the right national dance for Cuba. But...
Yeah, it is.
Oh, okay.
Don't tell Puerto Ricans that, but we did invent the salsa.
No. Right. So that's those characteristics are fine. As far as Confucianism was originally attacked by the party because of its association with the landlords. But the landlord's use of Confucianism, to my mind, is analogous to Pol Pot's use of Marxism. That you can say you're using that and because people had a great reverence for Confucius and twist it all out of shape. Well, look at Christianity. You have a goody two-shoes Pope over there that everybody likes now, even though he's still anti-woman, anti-abortion, doesn't have, women can't be priests. But he has lightened up on gay rights. He's lightened up on he's come out very progressively again, for medicine and for food for the poor people. And he's certainly a left-wing Pope compared to John Paul II. So there are Christians, and then there are Protestant Christians. There are Unitarians can't really be called Christians because if you're going to make the Trinity a part of this, but there are religious people who are progressive and reactionary. So Confucianism is broad enough that it can be interpreted in a progressive way. You can use it if you like. I will send you a little thing on Confucius, a dialogue between people trying to show that Confucianism and Marxism are compatible.
Interesting. We had a question pop up about liberation theology. What do you think about the role that liberation theology has played in Latin America and the building of socialist movements there?
I do not know how influential it has been down there. It seems that it got a lot of priests shot, cardinal assassinated or bishop assassinated, and brought out some really bad elements to try to take over governments. But the idea of liberation theology wasn't just in Latin America. It started in the workers' movement in France with priests that went into the factories to bring, that was before, and it was probably an inspiration of the liberation theology movement. It was the idea of the church itself having become really a tool of the aristocracy, the middle-age kings and dukes and stuff. And it was a conservative state-sponsored religion, and that the real Christianity, the real teachings of Jesus had been long forgotten. Peter was walking around, in these open-faced sandals with a cloak on, and the Pope is sitting there with rings and diamonds and crowns on his head. So it looked like, there's just something about this poor Peter poverty type church is not really living up to the Book of Acts, which is what they like to talk about, where there's this communist movement tries to, or sort of communist, where they share everything, where we get our little slogan from each according to his ability type of thing from the Book of Acts. So that was a movement that was taking real Christianity, a historically more accurate, perhaps, Christianity, the Christianity of slaves and outcasts and the underclass, where it grew up originally in the Roman Empire until it was taken over by Constantine and made the state religion of the Roman Empire, which obviously would change the focus of what it was going to do, not complain about how you're being treated by the emperor, but saying, yeah, the emperor, he's God's guy on earth too. So it had a very progressive movement. It was taking the ideas of social justice from Marxism, because of course it was the rise of communism that caused this reaction in the church amongst many people. Many priests came from working class backgrounds and came from poor backgrounds. And they realized the message of the communist parties in the early 20th century and even now was one of social justice for poor people who are actually getting oppressed. And the church was not responding in a meaningful way to the alleviation of this oppression, except preaching about it and trying to make it, but not doing anything actual about it. And these priests went out to bring this message of Christianity to the masses and help organize them. So I don't see any contradiction between the liberation movement and communists working together and mutually inspiring each other to build up the fight against capitalist oppression. Some priests in Latin America even became guerrilla leaders and were martyred. So if you want to use the term martyred, in fighting against capitalism. And the church realized that this was a real threat to their real institutionalized basis, which is in the bourgeoisie and the rich and the people who have political power. So the church did not like this movement. I don't think it ever approved of it. I think Francis may have been influenced by it. I don't really follow Catholic Church teachings and stuff. I don't know what his position is on I don't even know if the movement is still kicking down there. I knew about it in the 60s and 70s when it was very active. But I think it's had a big influence. We had something like that over here with the Riggins, with the Catholic Church, and of course we've had the Catholic worker movement here in the United States for generations now. So there's always been this social movement, this thing within the church, Protestant church too, hooking up with social ideas of Marxism. The problem, of course, is the fact that Marxists are atheists. And this is why Lenin wanted to go out of his way to not get us involved in religious disputes, because that would deflect us from the actual fact that we can have allies and work together to try and better the situation.
Yeah, it's funny. Althusser even mentions that Lenin tries to not talk about philosophy either with other folks in order to not have disputes in those fields as well. So I think we could all agree that there has been a sort of natural unification between the more radical elements of religion and communism, and specifically in Latin America, which I'm probably a bit more informed on. It has been a unification that has been based on practice. When the religious priests and religious folks went to the guerrillas, who did they find there? They found communists, and it was a marriage that started with practice and then was attempted to be theoretical. But we have reaffirmed a few times already, and in the article that's the section that's based on the speech that Lenin gives on the role of religion in working class parties. there's a constant affirmation of the atheistic positions that Marxists ought to have. So I wanted to bring up just a short passage from the manuscripts of 44, which of course is unpublished in Marx's life. It ends up being published in 32 after Lenin dies. But it comes after, it's written after the critique of Hegel's philosophy of right. And here he's saying that atheism has no meaning once you postulate socialism as the negation of the negation, because atheism mediates human essentiality through its being as a negation of God. So this seems to imply a sort of epoche in the skeptic sense position that it's that you refrain from speaking about religion at all, not just in a practical manner, but in a theoretical one too, that you just ignore completely the question of theism and atheism. What do you think about that, and what do you think specifically about that relation, that postulation by Marx and its relations to Lenin's positions on religion?
Well, 1844 manuscripts are unpublished in Marx's lifetime, I think, for a pretty good reason. And that is, when he was older, he and Engels remarked that these unpublished writings predating the manifesto were their way of educating themselves and beginning to get their ideas. And their ideas are not fully formed with a lot of these articles. And when they became fully formed, they put these articles aside, and then what they published is, what you get. Mm-hmm. I think they were fully formed by the time they wrote the German ideology to educate themselves. And that book, actually, they got it. They made it in that book. That didn't get published by accident, went out of business or something, some financial problem. And as you remember, they tossed it in the chest, and Marx left it to the gnawing criticism of the mice. That's another one that didn't come out until the 30s in the Soviet Union.
Yeah. I think the manuscripts come out, and then a couple years after, the German ideology comes out. So there's not much authority we can give to some of the views because they're developed before even the development of historical materialism as it comes about in the German ideology.
But Marx was right in the quote. He is talking about in theory. Atheism becomes meaningless in the realm of theory, because if religion is the opium of the masses, and you change the world situation through socialism so that the masses don't need the opium, then the dispute between theism and atheism becomes moot. And there's no, that's, atheism then in that sense becomes meaningless.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It's not meaningless right now.
Yeah.
But lots of people having problems with their parents because they're doing Marxism with Midwestern characteristics.
We had a question from the chat on the relationship that the class struggle plays in the cultural or the superstructural or ideological elements of the battle, which of course includes religious thought and practice. What do you consider to be the role of the class struggle in that sphere?
Oh, the only thing I understand it is that depending on your position in the economy, working class, rich person, son of the Kennedys, something like a Bush, a Baron Trump. I don't think he's going to be recruited to the YCL or anything when he gets up to college. Your class position, and therefore the class position of artists, influence your world outlook. And so you will have different types of music, different types of literature, poetry, novels, plays, based on your art, the artist's comprehension of what the world is based on their experience from their class. So that's why you have these art critics. When we go to the museum and you see paintings that are realistic, well, what do socialists like? Socialist realism. You see sweating peasants and rich people whipping them. You say, that's a great work of art. And then you see all these glorifications of Jesus from the Renaissance. Those are beautiful works of art, and they express the ideology of the ruling class of the Renaissance. There's no reason why we have to go around like in certain cultural revolution delusions and destroy these works of art, because they are part of the history of our coming to consciousness. There's no way people in the Renaissance could have thought of proletarian revolutions. They didn't have a proletariat. They didn't even have, capitalism was just beginning. So you can't expect that. But you can certainly look for art that reflects the interests of working people, and or just realistically tells you the world you live in. And great artists can overcome their own class prejudice. The great example of that, of course, is Engels' praise of Balzac. Balzac was a monarchist. He loved the aristocracy. He put the "de" in front of his name, which he didn't deserve to have there, so that he could look like he came from an aristocratic Honoré de Balzac, okay, with that little fake "de" of his, because he was aping the aristocracy. And he really loved them. And he liked the czar. He thought all that. But when he wrote his novels, he portrayed them exactly the way they are, which was rapacious and not evil, if you want to use that term. It's not really a good Marxist term, but exploitative. They were backstabbing and they oppressed people. And you read him and you get a picture of France and the bourgeoisie and the ruling class in France as a quite disreputable group. And that's why Engels liked Balzac. He said, here's a guy who's a monarchist who has all the horrible ideas. And yet when he writes his literature, he exposes the world as he really, really is. And you would learn, he said, you'd learn more about what capitalism is like and more about what this movement and what's going on in France by reading Balzac's novels than reading any of the sociological or historical books that are written by scholars in the universities. So I hope every Midwestern Marxist out there will read Balzac.
Definitely. We have a question from the audience, but before that, since we're in the topic of art, I just wanted to mention, for those interested, there's a good Spanish-Mexican philosopher who has delved with the topic of Marxist aesthetics quite a bit, Adolfo Sanchez Vasquez, and he's postulating many of the same theses that you are here. And as far as Marx, there's a lot of good stuff on Greek art in the Grundrisse. That's very nice to pull from for those interested. But yeah, Sebastian has a question. He's a fellow philosophy professor in Lima, Peru. So.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Professor Riggins. It was very interesting. I'm sorry if my English is not that good. I don't use it verbally that much. I have it was more of a commentary, because you said that you are not that much familiar with the situation in Latin America right now, with religion, I mean. And I just wanted to mention the change, some sort of changes that has happened after neoliberalization here in the 90s, in the early 90s, because as you may know, in Latin America and in South America, we have this proletarization without industrialization that gave way to migration from the country to the city. And in the 70s and the 80s, we had in Lima, Peru, this there appeared this sort of, we call them pueblos jóvenes, which means like sort of new towns, no? Right? And it's the name we use for these ghettos that are pretty much like the favelas and the Villa Miserias and everything. And religion, specifically priests on the left of the liberation theology and all that sort of left wing in the church, had a pretty big role politicizing these urban masses in this period, between 70s and 80s. But after the delegitimization of the left, because in Peru we had this war between Sendero Luminoso, the Shining Path, and the state. After that, most of the popular masses were pretty much tired of struggling, of open class struggle, and we had that kind of coincided. I mean that's a word. It coincided with Fujimori's presidency and neoliberalization, and it's interesting because as liberation theology receded, we had a lot of kind of new evangelical and Protestant churches that came mostly from the United States. They were financed by, I don't know how to call it, pastors, I think. Yeah, pastors. Mm-hmm. They were trained and they came financed by other churches in the US, and they sort of kind of replaced the liberation theology priests in the pueblos jóvenes. No? So in order to mediate this discontent popular masses from the the more of a socialist of class struggle common sense to a more how do you call it, like entrepreneur common sense, there was a need of a new religious movement to kind of do this softly. I mean, there was a need to do this transition in the common sense, like an ideological transition before the popular masses got to accept the changes, accept to the restructuration of economy that happened in the 90s. And it worked pretty well, actually. I mean, most of the new right that appeared in the 90s, the neoliberal right, goes hand in hand with the Opus Dei and the evangelical and Baptist, and I don't know if Baptist, but evangelical and a lot of Protestant right-wing churches that, as I say, are financed by America or American churches or whatever. So I don't know, it's kind of that, like, religion is, it appears to me that is a political instrument that needs to be appropriated either by the right or the left in a place like Peru, at least. And also it can be a weapon of imperialism, as I see it, because of the, it's not only the America or American imperialism gives way to ONGs or whatever here. It also brings churches. It also brings religion, and competes with the Catholic Church. It also allies with it, with the right-wing side of the church. But it's being an interesting phenomenon that hasn't been that much studied here. I don't know. That was my commentary.
Okay, I spent some time in Peru in the early parts of this century. I was dating a young lady who had been associated with the Shining Path. She was,
Been there too.
so I was able to get her to be a revisionist pro-Soviet person. She realized the errors of the way. Also, her mother made her give it up too. She was not particularly political. She moved her out of the areas where the science path was active. So I met her. She was up in Machu Picchu, which was safe. That was a zone for tourism.
Yeah, it is. It is.
Very well protected. The army knew what to protect. Protect us American tourists up there. Keep us happy. So, as the impression, but I didn't just stay in Mountain. I traveled all over on my own to different parts of the country. I got the impression there's a. By the way, I think we all agree. Shining past the relation to Marxism is more like Pol Pot's.
Yeah, it is. It is. I agree.
Any legitimate attempt to try and bring about good socialist type stuff. Yeah, especially their murder of progressive working people in there because they had the worse the better type philosophy going on for a while.
It's sort of a ultra leftist idealism.
Yes.
Yeah.
So unfortunately, the leader was a philosophy professor. So it's
specialized in Kant.
It's a shame. He was a Kant expert or something.
Yeah.
Violating the categorical imperative every day of his life. So it's embarrassing for our profession to have this guy, but he's locked away now where he should be probably. Make him read Marx for the rest of his life. Real Marx. Make him read Hegel, get the Kant taken out of him. Anyway, I think a great deal of illiteracy in the peasant areas and the native areas, and the Christianity has been preached there ever since Pizarro, I think, is your guy down there. And it's because of the illiteracy, they tend to be charismatic and emotional, and this is why these charismatic sects from the United States can come down there and carry on, because there's not a big intellectual theological understanding of Christianity in the poor people in Peru. I mean, as I understand it, I may be wrong. The Catholic Church, in fact, has reacted in defense by becoming itself starting to be having charismatic Protestant type meetings down there with music and emotional outbursts. But I was just a surface, down there. I was only down there 3 or 4 times. But I agree that there is a role for progressive religious teaching down there to back up regular, real, not the shining path would more likely be shooting us if we were down there trying to do that. I hope that they're still hanging out somewhere, or they've been completely suppressed.
No, they have a power base in the frontier with Bolivia, and they have it's pretty bad to say this, or sad to say this, but I think they are still, even if they are in the margins and they are pretty much they are divided between a lot of different groups, but they still are in some way the most organized political left-wing organization in the country.
Oh, that's sad to hear.
Yeah, even if they are marginal, they are small groups, but they have their power base in this region. It's called Puno. Yeah. And
I don't hear too much of them up here anymore. I don't see them in the press.
No. They have. I mean, they have renounced to the lucha armada, no, the armed revolt. But they do have different groups. There's this one called Movadef that is struggling for general amnesty, and you have FUDEP, that is the one I was talking to you about, that is associated with teacher unions. in the south, right? But yeah, they are still pretty much weak, but they have the organization capabilities that the other organizations in the left don't have, which is pretty sad, but it's how it is right now.
What is whatever happened? I should know this, but I didn't see much of the old pro-Soviet Communist Party down in.
Oh, you mean Unidad, unity.
Is it still there? It's still...
Yeah, but it's pretty much. I mean, I think they don't have new militants in a while. They have, yeah, it's pretty small. It's mostly veterans, and you have Patria Roja, which is like the Red Motherland, which is or Fatherland, which is the pro Beijing party.
They have motherland so that we're not chauvinistic.
Oh, okay. Okay. Yeah, it's gender neutral in Spanish, but yeah. It actually it isn't, right? Patria, but yeah, whatever. Yeah, they that one is getting pretty. It's like renovating itself. It's getting more young militants. It has the approve of the Chinese government. The leader of the party travels constantly to China. Yeah. But the good thing is that even though the pro-Soviet old party is small, it has made amends with Patria Roja. They collaborate right now. They collaborate and they are getting resources and contacts with the Chinese government. So at least the old Moscow Beijing split has been how do you say it?
Amended.
Amen. Yeah.
Oh yeah, that's happened all over in India. The two parties get together. Brazil.
Yeah, they're getting together. So yeah, but still we are trying to build a kind of new left, but
neo communism.
Yeah, but it's difficult. It's difficult. We had. I mean, I think Fujimori and neoliberalism in the 90s, they made a pretty good job with their hegemony building. With building a new hegemony and a new common sense. It's they depoliticize most of at least Limean population, and Lima is still half of the country. So yeah, it weighs a lot. And there's but we'll see what happens in there. They have elections in the next few months, so we'll see.
Dr. Riggins, I had probably one more question. It's already getting to the hour mark, but there seems to be a rise in what's called Christian atheism lately, where people take the ethical dimension of Christianity, the agape and the radical form of love, and they'll hold on to that while sort of ignoring the more transcendental, perhaps transcendental is not a good, the more common way that people think of Christianity as God as omnipotent, all that stuff. What are your views on the relationship that this form of Christianity that relates itself more to the solidarity and loving community aspect than to this separate and distinct and all-powerful God? What do you think your relationship of this and Marxism is? Do you think it changes the dynamic if we consider that as Christianity to what the other sort of elements of Christianity might be?
Well, there's there's nothing new under the sun, because I grew up with the Thomas Jefferson Bible. And Thomas Jefferson, as you know, took the Holy Bible, the New Testament, and he struck out every passage having to do with transcendence, deity, God, leaving only the teachings of Jesus that were secular. And he said, you know, you can base your ethics and morality on that basis. Jesus was a great teacher for humanity, and I'm sure it influenced some of the ideas he had in the Declaration of Independence. Because, you know, originally he was going to include slavery, the abolition of slavery, in the Declaration of Independence, but the southern states prevented that. They wouldn't have adopted that. So I think that was under the influence of Paine that he did that, because he and Paine were friends. So it's just revival of something that's going on from way back. Engels wrote about that when he wrote about these Anabaptist movements, the peasant revolt in Germany. The peasants weren't talking about pie in the sky. They were quoting the social gospel, and they wanted communism. What they understood is Bible communism, sharing all the money, the wealth, the women. I don't know if the women like the sharing. They have to say mutual sharing. If you're sharing all the women, well, then the men are getting shared too. So they should put them both in there. Communism of men and women. Okay, so Plato started that. He should have been more inclusive. So I think it's a good idea to work with these people. I don't see how it can hurt. We need all the help we can, because the bourgeoisie is so entrenched in the world system that they control everything. So the only way we can, where there's possibility for democratic movements to try and bring about some fundamental change, you have to work in those movements. But until there is, I don't think socialism ever came around where there wasn't some type of collapse of the civilization. As World War I, the end of World War II, in Cuba, it was a complete collapse of the Batista regime, was no longer able to run anything down there. So I mean, how can you come over in a little speedboat from Mexico and overthrow the government if that government hasn't gone completely to pieces on its own first, like with its own internal problems? So yes, I think we have to work and build as big and broad a party as possible, but not, I believe in Dimitrov. I think Dimitrov, though, limited this broad mass movement to working class groups. I don't think he invited the ruling class organizations in there. Although some left-wing parties, when they talk about Dimitrov, they use him to have these broad popular alliances that include actually, you know, like the American Manufacturers Association or something. If they're gonna be anti-Trump, you can be with us. So yes, I think that's a good thing. I think we should defend Jefferson more than he is getting, you know, there were problems, of course, in the context of the civilization and slavery there, but he was not in favor of slavery. I mean, he wanted to get rid of it, but he was not economically viable without it. So what do you do? St. Paul, we Christians forgive St. Paul. He told slaves to be obedient to their masters. So it says that in the Bible. We don't say, get that book out of here. So I think we can do more to emphasize the progressive aspects of Jefferson and what he represented, and at the same time be unsparingly critical of compromises that he had to make in favor of slavery.
Especially considering the vast influence that his democratic and republicanist ideals had on the early socialists of the 19th century in the US.
Oh yeah, the big communist education center in New York City after the war was called the Jefferson School. They wouldn't name it that today.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, Dr. Riggins, it has been an absolute pleasure to hear you talk about the relationship of Marx and Marxism and religion and a little bit more. So thank you all who watched, and we'll catch you next time.